So can I just say I think we are going to agree on this, but like, Fritz deserved what he got. Like, he fucked around, he found out. Like
100%.
I did not cry. I like clapped when that happened. I was like, go monster.
Right. Welcome, friends, to episode 234 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And this week we discuss James Whale's 1931 film, Frankenstein.
Joining us this week in our old abandoned watchtower is Rachael K. Jones. Rachael is a World Fantasy Award nominee and Tiptree Award honoree whose fiction has appeared in dozens of venues worldwide, including multiple Year's Best anthologies, Lightspeed Magazine, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Strange Horizons, and all 4 Escape Artist podcasts. Welcome back to the show, Rachael.
It's awesome to be back 2 weeks in a row.
Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, you get the full experience, right? Like this is really what we do. We read the book and then we watch the movie, and it's a journey, right? Like you get to feel the journey of I don't know, just like living with the literature and the book and the words, and then seeing some sort of adaptation. You know, every time we do it, it's a little different.
It's kind of like being in the metaphorical basement of that watchtower you're talking about and not being able to get out. And so maybe by the end of this, you'll open the door and let me go wander out in the world.
Oh no, were you trapped in there?
Yeah.
Is Fritz coming in? All right. You know, often we get different kinds of adaptations. We have ones that are very faithful. We have ones that are reimagined, but still the essence of the story is there. This felt like one of those where it was almost more inspired by. There are certain bones of the original story that I think are still there, but the flesh and soul has been swapped out in true in Frankenstein fashion, and this is a whole different monster.
They swapped a criminal brain in.
Abnormal brain.
Yeah, very abnormal.
So I love that we got the chance to cover this 1931 film. I don't know your experience with older classic film like this. I'd love to hear, Rachael, your history with this film and just your experience going through and watching it as it's, almost 100 years old now. This
was a really new experience for me. I don't have a lot of experience watching movies that are this old. And so as a result, I found it a really unique and rewarding experience, actually, because as an author, there were some interesting plot decisions that maybe I felt like made it a much simpler story and less complex than what Mary Shelley was doing in the space of a full novel. I found a lot to appreciate about it as a piece of cinematic history, and the performance of Boris Karloff is so incredibly iconic that even if you're not in the realm of film like I am, it's hard to avoid it and hard to not appreciate just what he did with that role, and the fact that when people say Frankenstein, they think of this movie even more so than the book. So I think that's just absolutely fascinating to me.
How about you, Luke? What was it like going back and watching a film like this?
So we've talked in the past about how I don't normally watch old black and white movies. I've seen a few, and we've watched a few now for the podcast. And each time I am sort of reminded that they're not a monolith. When I used to think back about movies predating color, I imagined they were all kind of similar. And it's not like a conscious thought, just subconsciously I assume they share certain characteristics, but they are all very different. Just like movies today, made by different people with different visions, different level of artistry. And I was impressed with certain things in this movie that felt modern. It felt sort of, I don't know, ahead of their time. And I could see the influence on filmmakers that are working in the later years, some that we've even covered on this podcast in particular I'll talk about. So that was all super fascinating. I'd never seen this movie before. I'd seen clips, I think, certain scenes, but yeah, never actually watched the full thing. It's an hour and 10 minutes, And that also includes like a brief sort of opening introductory scene, which was very unique. It's one of the actors coming out onto a stage and warning you about the movie you're about to watch. Pretty cool, actually, but very strange. But then, it's a tight hour 10, so there's not a lot of time to develop all of the story and nuance that was in the novel. So runtime alone, I think, forces this into a very different sort of movie. And then, it felt to me like there was an attempt to make a horror film, right? Like, whereas Frankenstein, the novel, is sort of horror, but really more remembered as a science fiction novel. It had certainly frightening, especially for the time, 1800s. But this was like, this is a horror movie. And it felt like the kind of thing that you would show on Halloween. Now, this was way back in the 1930s, but still, like, it felt almost like you would see a horror film today that is released in October, and they want you to go see it in that time of year. Like, this felt like it was designed to be spooky and to thrill, and it's basically said in the introduction by the actor who comes out and says, "This may disturb you, this may horrify you," which I thought was pretty funny.
It's also amazing because in the same way that Mary Shelley sort of invented this new genre, this was still seen as a time where people weren't making horror films, like quote unquote horror films.
Yeah.
So this is a science fiction film that is a horrific science fiction film.
So you're saying this kind of helped create that genre?
It absolutely did.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think we've talked a lot, and I just love to talk about this because I'm nerdy about film history. But how many times have I mentioned German Expressionism on this podcast?
Yeah.
This is so heavily influenced by German Expressionism. Films like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is like a good one to point to. And you can tell the way that it's shot, certain sort of Gothic elements that you see within the architecture and the lighting, the way that this movie sort of distills all that. This, along with Dracula, which released the same year, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Universal Pictures released Dracula, and then with the success of Dracula, wanted to make a monster movie again, make Frankenstein, which is sort of what I think you're picking up on there, Luke, is that rather than making a Mary Shelley film, I think they tried to make a monster film and sort of defined what would go on to become a horror film. So yeah, it's just interesting to think about this German Expressionism continuing to pop up and what would eventually go to influence like film noir in the 40s and the 50s. And then you get into your modern horror films, and so much is owed to these older Universal films. And we'll talk more about that. But and this film also just so happens to be very like German in general. Their names are German. There's like Herr, however you say that, Herr so-and-so, and a lot of the architecture and like the normal buildings that you see in the town looks like a small German town. And so I felt like this was like kind of a distilled look at German Expressionism from Americans, because they're, absorbing what's coming over from Germany.
That was going to be my question. Like, was this an American-made movie, though?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely, man. So the one that I kept going to, and you can tell me if this connects, but we covered Sleepy Hollow and Tim Burton. And Tim Burton always has a very distinct sort of Gothic flair to his filmmaking in that movie in particular. And there's even a scene in at the end of that movie, if I'm remembering correctly, in a windmill that gets lit on fire. And I was like, is this actually an homage to this movie? Because it was so similar.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah, and like just his way that he like his sets are often surreal, and I felt that way in that old abandoned watchtower, where like the brick was like kind of warped. It didn't really look like a real building, but I felt like that was a style choice.
Yeah, and those sets are incredible. Like looking at the laboratory and how big they are, and the moving camera, that was also sort of revolutionary for the time period. We'll talk about James Whale a bit and his style, taking influence from German Expressionism and this moving camera, but those sets are exactly what I'm talking about. This sort of, if you look at there's like elongated architecture that's also like not structurally sound. They're
Right,
like
yeah.
leaning a lot of times and jagged edges and things like that. And that's absolutely like Gothic inspired as well. I think if you asked Tim Burton, he would 100% cop to the fact that he was making homage to a film like this.
I thought the sets were incredible. It's something I noticed that I thought really held up well, even after 100 years. Does anyone know, by chance, if this movie was considered scary at the time it was made?
Oh, yeah.
Because, the little content warning at the beginning, part of me was like, is this just, like, hype? Or is this, like, really valid, like,
They in the way that a lot of film, you'll hear about The Exorcist. They had people passing out in the theater and that kind of stuff, like people freaking out. This had that, in the 30s. This was that for the 30s. They had the combination of Dracula and Frankenstein, like back to back, and people were just like totally enthralled. And they like some, of course, had the thing where they're sort of like, is this real life? I read stories about people like fainting and watching it and being completely horrified. And it is so funny to think about that because today it just feels quaint, like just completely. To think of it an era where like someone goes to a movie theater and is so horrified by this.
I mean, there's a certain kind of disgusting concept, right? Like the body and you see the sewn flesh and the look on the face of the creature. Like a lot of that is still pretty compelling even today, and I could see that being pretty upsetting to people who haven't had the experience of seeing all the stuff we've seen nowadays. Yeah. I go back to that. There's a story about one of the earliest films I think ever made, where it's just like a train arriving at a station or something.
Yeah, train in the station or something like that.
And so reportedly, show times were filled with people who would like flee the theater when it was happening because they thought it was like a train was going to.
They thought the train was going to burst through the screen. Yeah, pretty amazing.
Which is hilarious to think about now, but yeah, I mean it's a magic trick, and people weren't used to it. So I have a question before we get into everything else that I thought we could sort of noodle on a little bit. This is one of the only movies I can think of where the creature in the movie is like commonly known as the wrong name, right? Like we have had to catch ourselves several times, at least I know I have, calling the monster Frankenstein. And I'm wondering if that is only because it doesn't have a name, but there are a lot of other movies where the creature is unnamed, but then why does this monster get the name of its creator in people's minds? Like, why is that transposition happening?
I have a theory. This is based on nothing but my own brain, so my very abnormal brain. But my thought when I was watching the film, especially, was that like Boris Karloff is such a scene stealer. Like, it's almost like when I watched it, it was the most significant thing about the movie was appreciating his performance and what he brought to that role. That I could almost see that like through a game of telephone. That when there's a word Frankenstein and there's this creature you have associated with it, and like that's kind of it. Like of course you name the movie after the most interesting thing in the movie, and in some ways it was kind of Mary Shelley's mistake, to call it Frankenstein when
I'm wondering if this happened before the movie. Like when people were referring to the book monster, did they often make this mistake, or was this a like you said, like a sort of a something that occurred because of this film, and people are telling their friends, hey, go see Frankenstein, you're going to love the monster in this movie Frankenstein, and somehow that connection got made.
Especially with Dracula in the mix, if that's really, the same time period that,
Dracula and Frankenstein, and Dracula is the name of the monster.
Yeah. Best friends.
Yeah, maybe. It could have something to do with that.
And one of the reasons that I think kind of makes sense is if you were to give the monster a last name as it's sort of Victor Frankenstein's son, then it would still be a Frankenstein, right? In a sense. But I think another thing that really solidified it for people was when the film Bride of Frankenstein released in 1935, it's literally called Bride of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So then they're making the decision to call the monster Frankenstein.
Right. Or were they reacting to what people already called it as?
Good question. That is a good question.
It doesn't help that also, maybe it helps that the word Frankenstein is kind of entered our lexicon as a word that means a patched together thing. So you have like your Frankensteinian, like dog, like Frankenweenie, is that the one? Like, yes, Franken plus anything.
Speaking of Tim Burton, totally completely making a Frankenstein film right there with Frankenweenie.
You're right. Yeah. I was thinking about how with the Universal monsters that you talked about, that was something we heard was incredibly influential for Stephen King. When we covered It, And then we remember those Universal monsters are in.
He puts a lot of them in there. Yeah, the Mummy's in there, Wolfman's in there.
Yeah,
the Invisible Man I think is in there.
Yeah, because that was the stuff he grew up on, right? And frightened him so much. So we just talk about the lineage of things that would go on to affect horror as a genre, right? Because I don't know that there's any more influential figure in horror, in modern days than Stephen King. And if he was greatly influenced by Frankenstein, which goes all the way back to Mary Shelley, I don't know, it's pretty cool when you see all these connective tissue.
I don't know about you guys, but growing up, I feel like there were kids that would be on the playground that would reference this movie having not seen it. There's no way these kids had seen this film. And they would walk around with their arms out, and they'd be like, "It's alive," and all these things. And it's like, it's crazy how it penetrated the zeitgeist through, like, I was a kid in the 90s, so it's like, and
Yeah. Well, there were so many other versions of it. And I think there was cartoon versions of it that I remember seeing. I thought the assistant's name was Igor for some reason, and I think that's from some show I saw where the assistant's name was Igor, whereas here it's Fritz. So I don't know where that came from. And then also the idea that it was Henry Frankenstein instead of Victor Frankenstein, I was so surprised by that. I'm like, it's always Victor. So in this version, they changed the name, but in other versions, I haven't seen that as much.
Do you know why Frankenstein, I'm going to call him Frankenstein because that's sort of the context we're talking about, the monster in here, is usually green?
Oh, no. Is that some artifact of the way black and white used to look?
They actually covered Boris Karloff in green paint in order to get the color that they wanted his skin to look in the black and white film.
Oh, interesting.
Wow.
So he really was green walking around on set.
I just thought it was like a rotting flesh thing, or like,
yeah,
a
that
zombie
makes sense
reference
too.
somehow.
Yeah.
He was like literally green when he filmed this. That's interesting. Wow.
His whole suit, just to talk about the practical effect of having the monster and having it be believable. I mean, the way he has his face sunken in, I think I read that he actually had a few of he had like a bridge removed from his teeth so that it would sink in, his face would sink in that way.
Wow.
So he did a lot to try to like create this character. And I think it plays on screen as well. Like you see like the prosthetic on top of his head so that his head is flat and the like electrodes on his neck, like all of these interesting decisions that were used have become so iconic now.
Right.
I thought it really tied in. This might be, too soon to talk about this, but I thought, like, as a movie that leans into science fiction tropes, those decisions to me seem much more related to the field of phrenology. Like, a lot of the science in the movie was very much like, instead of it being about anatomy, it's going to be about phrenology and about, like, the idea that the shape of your head determines your character, and even, like, the criminal body parts are somehow going to result in a creature has criminal dispositions, although I don't really feel like that held up in the plot. I'm like, he was kind of provoked quite a lot.
Oh, yeah.
The
other thing I wanted to do is sometimes people listen to our movie episodes without listening to our book episodes, which I know is shocking, but sometimes people do that. So I just wanted to actually take a second and let people know who you are as a writer, and that you said last week that you do work in science fiction and horror, with body horror in particular, and that's one reason why we wanted to have you on for Frankenstein. So if you could talk a little bit about that and like how this movie maybe made you think of your own work and the body horror that you write.
Yes. Wow. Big topic. So this is a little bit of a recap for anyone who listened for last week, but for my day job, I'm also a scientist. I'm a speech language pathologist. And as part of my training, I did human dissections, which is kind of exciting and interesting. And a lot of that training, that experience really shaped me as a science fiction writer as well, because I'm very interested in the fact that human bodies work at all, like, because when you start studying it, it's just an unbelievable system that seems like that it should just fall apart any minute. And I find that really interesting to get into in science fiction, and even like some of Mary Shelley's themes of like, what do we owe our creations as human beings, and like, what are there lines you can cross in the the world of science that are a bridge too far, and like, what is a body, like, can you, if you remix it, like, is it still the same person, like, a lot of these bits and pieces that you get that I think are also really present in the film as well as in the book, and I think that this movie especially made me think a lot about, like, to me it seemed to be a movie much more distinctly about the ethics of science than even so the book was, because I think the book kind of gets into some deeper philosophical stuff, but the movie to me was concerned with this question of like, Victor, well, sorry, he's not Victor in this movie, Dr. Frankenstein, I guess. Is he playing God? Is it like bad? Like, and then, what is this creature and what should you do with it? And like, does it have feelings and should it be destroyed? And like, they're just being kind of like a sense of disquietude and discomfort and this thing that Dr. Frankenstein does. I'm going to say that through this entire episode. I am so sorry that I'm not going to be able to get his name right.
Well, it's hard because you're talking about the two characters who are the same character, yet they have in one version it's Victor and one version it's Henry. So
right,
you're right.
Yeah. And the interesting distinction too is like we meet his professor and he's like, yeah, he didn't finish school, he ran away, so he's not even a doctor. It's crazy.
Right.
I was shocked to realize that.
Yeah,
he's like kind of a dropout.
And then there is a character named Victor in this version, so that further muddies the waters.
Right.
So I'm trying to get Henry. So like, I think it's interesting that Henry in the movie version is way less ashamed of what he does too. Like, he's just kind of like, I'm obsessed. Leave me alone so you don't throw off my groove. And then when a whole audience, including his fiance, shows up to like watch the animation of this corpse, he's like, sure, you can watch as long as you don't interrupt me. Like, versus the one in the book who's kind of like, definitely doesn't want to be caught with what he's doing and is very ashamed when he realizes what he's done. And
it's a big secret the whole time in the book, right? And here it was not a secret at all.
A lot of the sort of subtlety of the book has been replaced with, sort of over the home plate kind of pitching. It felt like they were trying to make this broadly accessible. So a lot of the what it means to be alive and to be a person that Mary Shelley was dealing with is sort of stripped away from this version, and it's a lot more about, is it ethical to create life? And once you do, what's your responsibility to it? And in fact, we're going to tell you in the opening introduction that this mad scientist did this without first reckoning upon God. And so it's like, this is bad. We know it's bad. You know it's bad. Now sit back and be horrified, I
Experience
guess.
it, yeah. I think they knew what audiences were ready for at the time. I think that if they had made the other film, that were the Mary Shelley version, where we're going into the philosophy of it all, in that medium, I just don't think audiences were ready yet. It was too early stages.
Yeah.
Clearly, I mean, this did super well, although obviously the book was around well before, so there was an audience for the book as well. Yeah,
it's so different. It's like, it's funny how the literary and film audiences are different, even to this day, and have different expectations, even though there's overlap there. It's not as much as you might think.
I love that now that we've got out of the studio system, though, right? There are indie films that can kind of approach that sort of literary look at this, like, you know what I mean? They're closer than they used to be.
There's just a lot more movies being made nowadays, too, so.
Right.
More opportunity for that. I did, before we move into the actual plot, in the introduction, they show the credits.
Yes, can we talk about that?
Yeah, they did Mary Shelley so bad. She is quoted as being adapted by Mrs. Percy B. Shelley, which I thought that was so disrespectful.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
What did I say last week? That you find the nearest man and you just assign the credit to him? Yeah. And I was like, oh, they did it!
Yeah.
It's so disrespectful.
Yeah, I don't know why that decision was made. Bizarre. And yeah, Mrs. Percy B. Shelley, come on.
That's crazy, yeah. This is a weird time for filmmaking too, because I don't know how familiar you are with the sort of film history version of the censorship that went on with like the Hays Code and the Motion Picture Production Code censorship that was going on. So around this time, right at Frankenstein, honestly, maybe because of these like horror films and some of the gangster films that were starting to come out, they created a commission and like basically the government started saying like, these are the ethical codes that you have to stick to in filmmaking. And they started to censor a lot of things. And there is a cut of this film that existed for a long period of time where they cut out sections of this film. They cut out where Boris Karloff's monster throws the girl into the water.
Oh, wow.
When he like grabbed her, they cut away. And like things like that were so what they were looking for were depictions of sexual innuendo, romantic and sexual relationships between white and black people, mild profanity, illegal drug use, promiscuity, prostitution, infidelity, abortion, intense violence, and homosexuality.
Wow.
So obviously, like
all the best stuff.
all the things that make life worth living, right? They decided to crack down on. But yeah, it was pretty bad, and people were blacklisted, people lost their jobs, and were never able to work in the industry again after that. So this is mostly, it starts to crack down in like 34 or so. So this was right before that, which is why they released another cut to censor some of the things that were going on. So just Mary Shelley being miscredited doesn't surprise me either. Like with all the things that were building up in that, and it was such a big, like I said before, the studio system was the only way that films were released. So it was all coming through a few white men's hands, you know.
Yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Like
right.
That attitude is still there, right? Like we've sort of beaten it back, but like so much of American politics is about that exact kind of mentality trying to assert power in this country. So sorry, a little bit of an aside, but it just makes me think of that, right?
Right.
Like if they still had control, right? Like that would still be a thing. That would still be the way we were censoring all of our media.
Luckily, that doesn't last forever. We are able to have some uncensored films these days for the time being.
Somewhat, at least, yeah. I mean,
there's still like a rating system that's implemented, obviously, eventually. But I'd love to talk a little bit about the filmmaker here. James Whale was an English film director, theater director, and actor who spent the greater part of his career in Hollywood. He is best remembered for several horror films: Frankenstein, The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein, which are all considered classics. Whale also directed films in other genres, including the 1936 film version of the musical Showboat. He's known for developing a style characterized by the influence of German Expressionism and a highly mobile camera. One of the most iconic shots from the film is the reveal of the monster. Do you guys remember how that plays out? He sort of opens the door, walks in backwards.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's like a push in as his face is revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And like these are things that like we think of today in filmmaking. Like like dynamic motion to the camera is so inherent to making a film now. But it was kind of novel at the time. Like it was sort of a thing some filmmakers would turn their nose up at. So it's cool to see him developing the style alongside German Expressionism. And like I said, this would go on to influence a lot of film noir, basically takes over the next couple decades, and it owes a lot to this style of filmmaking.
I definitely noticed the camera motion. There were several scenes where it felt modern to me, like the slowly panning in on people. There was the scene where the camera walks through the street in that German town, and there's all these extras performing. A lot of that stuff, like I wouldn't have expected in a movie from the 30s. Like I was thinking, like this is before World War II. Like this is so long ago. To think about these people and like what they were about to go through in their lives as the entire world was about to be, torn apart by war in the coming decades, and just how, I don't know, that was kind of a surreal moment for me, even thinking about that. And it just goes to show like how long ago this truly was, as far as like what we think of as just like common knowledge, like was not established at this point.
There's actually something cool that I didn't realize. Whale is credited with being the first director to use a 360-degree panning shot in a feature film in this film, Frankenstein.
Is that the one where... Wait,
Wow.
360-degree panning shot. Is that when he's looking through... No, that has to be something different. Because I noticed when Henry and the monster look at each other through the spinning mill.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't
That's
think...
a great shot.
I don't think it spins.
They use the motion of that wheel going around to cut so that it's a really clean cut. And it almost like hides the cut, and they like turn into each other. It's such a cool shot.
That's so clever. I'm really appreciating this conversation because these are things that I just completely missed as a non-expert in this area.
I've just learned a lot from James over the years, so I notice more things now than I did originally.
It's it's all intentional. That's my favorite thing to talk to people about, is just like everything that you see in the frame, every decision that's made, every movement of the camera, every framing decision. Things in the background. I love to just like stop and analyze things in that way.
Well, and there's a correlation to me with writing, right? Like you think about, like the average reader doesn't realize all of the nuance that's going into like just even a paragraph of prose, and how as a writer you can sit there and talk about all the decisions that are being made on multiple levels within that prose, and like. But like, I mean, it's much like movies. Like the average audience member doesn't pick up on all of that, but maybe it's there subconsciously.
I think it is. Like I know that I always like to say with the medium of writing that if you're doing it correctly, it looks easy and effortless and obvious. And I think it's probably true in film too. That like you kind of know when something's going off rails. Like if you've ever if you're an amateur, you can be watching a movie or reading a book and you're just kind of not entirely into it for some reason. And, you can't really figure out why. You're just like, oh, I don't know, it's fine. I'm just not into it. And like, I always find that those sorts of experiences for like non-experts is like, that's the moment where like you're picking up on it, whatever it is. And sometimes like you're watching a movie where you just can't look away. Like, like watching Fury Road, for example, where like, if you're not an action movie person, Fury Road is just so incredibly well made as a film that like, you can't look away.
Yeah.
Right.
Even if you don't understand how a trick is working,
no,
you can still be affected by it, right? Like
exactly. You're like, it's just great.
I also think a lot about effort. Like, you might blow through a paragraph in a book that took an author like a month to write, like,
oh God, yes.
or like having to come back and revise it so many times. And like, same thing with film. It's the amount of preparation I think is lost a lot of times for people, that like the amount of effort that goes into some of these things. And then with film, you also have the time constraint and all these people and burning money and all that kind of thing as well. So it's just, I say it all the time, is just like the fact that any film is ever good is a miracle for sure.
And with so many more people too, because with the novel, I can kind of control it because I'm usually the only finger in that pot. But yeah.
Yeah.
Well, your imagination is your only limit, right? Like with film, they're like, you'll have like a location manager come up and be like, no, we can't do that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah. I mean, and the amount of limitations there used to be, compared to today where you can do almost anything. Like, yeah, that
right.
was.
Well, and like we saw, I don't know if you know how much you noticed these like Tesla coil sort of electrical things. I read a lot about these, and there's a man named Ken Strickfaden who created all the electrical gadgets and effects for the movie, and also doubled for Boris Karloff during the sequences that showed the volt sparks playing all over his body. This person created all of this, and I guess they reused these electrical gadgets in The Bride of Frankenstein and a lot of other films. And then when Mel Brooks found out that the lab equipment was still working, he used it in the comedy Young Frankenstein in 1974. And he gave Strickfaden on-screen credit that he didn't receive from this film or any of the other films. And I also read that like Kiss was using, the rock band Kiss was using some of the actual screen used gadgets on their tour in 1976.
Oh my God.
How did they get a hold of those?
But I know, right? Isn't that crazy? But apparently they were deemed too dangerous and unpredictable. So they ended up, so it's like, that's crazy to think in the 70s, they were like, this is too dangerous and unpredictable. And these actors were like all around them in the 30s.
Yep.
And just thinking about like, safety guidelines and things like that we've learned about on past projects. Like, it's crazy to think that while you're giving a performance, you might need to be thinking about like crazy arcing electrical volts and stuff. Yeah.
Primitive electricity like shooting through the air and wow.
Yeah. Another really notable thing about James Whale that I loved was he lived as an openly gay man throughout his career in the British theater and in Hollywood, which was unheard of at the time period. Normally, a lot of discrimination against people who would come out in this way. Had like a successful career, and unfortunately, there's a film called The Road Back in 1937 that he was creating, and apparently there was some pushback from the studio and some other like forces that eventually were found to be like Nazi affiliated, because this is like 1937. So he effectively was forced out of the industry because there were so many setbacks, and this movie cost so much money and pressures from different organizations. Again, pre-World War II, when things are going crazy, and this that would kind of be his last film, and then he would I think he had one more with The Man in the Iron Mask in 1939, and then he retired from film in 41 because he basically was like kind of blacklisted and just wasn't allowed to work any longer. So just crazy to think like someone who created Frankenstein and like really made film noir and German expressionism more accessible and seen by a lot of people, eventually would go on to be blacklisted. And then I also did read, unfortunately, he committed suicide later in life around 67, which is just tragic.
Is that at 1967 or when he was aged 67?
He was 67 in 1957.
57, okay.
So it's irresistible for me not to like rethink this movie like as terms of its subject as like, through that lens of like a queer filmmaker and, people literally carrying torches to go and burn you down, and like just this experience of like, just being this, pure creation that, isn't doing anything to hurt anyone and just being tortured from the moment that you exist, to the moment you die. So,
I think you're picking up on something a lot of film critics have seen over the years that like absolutely is in the, it's baked into the film.
Yeah, if we're ready to talk about it, one of the things I was struck by was the empathy shown to the monster. I wasn't really expecting that in this version. Like, it's definitely in Mary Shelley's work. I think it's one of the key fixtures of that novel, but I thought this was going to be, hey, here's a monster. Isn't it scary? But I empathize with the monster a ton in this movie.
So sympathetic. Like, and it's interesting because like when the movie started and we started off with like, Henry Frankenstein scavenging corpses and getting the abnormal brain and all these little bits that were, to me, telegraphing that there was going to be something really wrong with the monster. I was surprised when then it goes and shows us the monster getting tortured by Fritz, and even like the very upsetting scene where the real professor is like trying to have his autopsy of him, and like there just being all these things where you can see the monster is just getting tormented, and I can't blame him. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't feel like that he did anything really on purpose, and he was just kind of scared all the time. And
I couldn't really wrap my head around, as far as the story was concerned, why they started tormenting the monster so quickly.
I don't know. It's so random.
The same reason that Victor Frankenstein in the novel was immediately horrified and fled. I think it's just they immediately see this thing as other and not inhuman and an animal, as the other professor says. Are we ready? Maybe we should start with some summary.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay.
So, Frankenstein begins with Edward Van Sloan stepping from behind a curtain to break the fourth wall and deliver a brief caution to the audience. Then, in a village of the Bavarian Alps, Henry Frankenstein and his assistant Fritz piece together a human body. Some of the parts are from freshly buried bodies, and some are from the bodies of recently hanged criminals. In a laboratory he's built inside a watchtower, Henry desires to create a human, giving this body life through electrical devices. He still needs a brain for his creation. At a nearby school, Henry's former teacher, Dr. Waldman, shows his class the brain of an average human being and the corrupted brain of a criminal for comparison. Henry sends Fritz to steal the healthy brain from Waldman's class. Fritz accidentally damages it and so brings Henry the corrupt brain. Henry's fiancée, Elizabeth, speaks with her friend Victor about the scientist's peculiar actions and his seclusion. Elizabeth and Victor ask Waldman for help understanding Henry's behavior, and Waldman reveals he is aware Henry wishes to create life. Concerned for Henry, they arrive at the lab just as he makes his final preparations for the lifeless body on an operating table. As the storm rages, Henry invites Elizabeth and the others to watch. Henry and Fritz raise the operating table towards an opening at the top of the tower. The creature and Henry's equipment are exposed to the lightning storm and empowered, bringing the creature to life. It's alive!
Yeah. I posted that scene on our Instagram story because I was like, this is one of the most iconic scenes in movie history, right? Like, it has to be. If you were to cut together, 50 most iconic scenes of all time, like, I think this one might be in there.
I think I read something along those lines, like the AFI or somebody had some sort of voting system, and that this scene made the cut of like one of the greatest scenes of all time.
Yeah, and it holds up. I think it's great. Like the sort of madness that is coming through his voice and the taboo of creating life and without first reckoning upon God, as said in the intro. I think that all comes across in this moment. But let's back up to the beginning of the novel of the film, and talk about this grave digging scene, grave robbing scene. I thought there was, and this starts here, but it continues through a lot of the scenes. Some really interesting decisions being made with skeletons and skulls and shadows. Where you see, and like I think it was like a statue in the graveyard that was a skeleton, and it was like looming over the burial. And then later in the college, it's like on this little wire, and it's like bouncing at one point, so you see the shadow of the skeleton almost like dancing on the wall, and it was lit kind of low, so the shadow was cast like into the classroom.
German Expressionism, that's it, dude.
Yeah,
that was it. Low angle, high contrast. And like shadows climbing up the walls like that, being larger than the characters themselves. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and in particular the skulls, right? Because then later we get the conversation with the professor, and he's just got these skulls lined up on a shelf, and there's like all this stuff all around him, and yeah, I thought like there was the diagrams even of anatomy behind him were kind of I don't know, gross. It was like there was a lot of muscle tissue, and I think they know that people are a little bit put off by anatomy, and so they wanted that to be in the frame for all these scenes.
Yeah, well, I just to talk about it, because you mentioned when he bumps into the one in the school, when he's stealing the brain, I read that that's a real human skeleton.
Wow.
Because film producers found it faster and cheaper to purchase a real human skeleton from a biological supply house rather than creating an artificial one.
There's an uncredited actor there in the film.
Somebody's there. Somebody made the cut and they didn't even know it.
One of the many uncredited actors in this movie. They only credit about 12 people, I think, in the entire
Speaking of credits, too, did you see that the next to the monster, there was a question mark?
Yeah, in the opening. At the end, they actually say Boris Karloff, but in the beginning, it's just like, question mark?
What is that?
Is it leading to sort of that Blair Witch thing? It's believable. We don't know. It was a real creature that wandered onto set.
I think they were wanting you to wonder if it was a real creation. Yeah.
I got almost like shades of, during that period of time, you would have had like eugenics being a big thing, like in addition to phrenology, but like some shades of that idea, like in some of the imagery and some of the like even abnormal versus normal brain and the criminal bodies, and it's just kind of an interesting, once again, on the shade of World War II, like this being a period where that was a
in a pseudoscience being stated as fact, right? Like, and we still see that all the time, and how if people don't know to think critically about what you're hearing, and that not every time someone with any measure of authority says something authoritatively doesn't mean it's true. And yeah, like that professor saying, like, you can see the difference in the brain between this criminal and this average. You look at it, you could tell that it's different in the front. And it's like, no, you probably can't do that.
And what I think it's important to mention, because the fact that this movie derives a lot of its horror from that, and maybe even more so than for us today, like this idea of like this, the horror of the unknown, the horror of like what's in your DNA and what, the dirty people that, like, obviously it's a very, very, very racist belief and, a piece of pseudoscience, but, a lot of that idea of like, who is criminal and who looks like a criminal and,
It's hard because like I'm of two minds when I'm watching stuff from this period where it's like, yeah, it doesn't hold up to today's sort of viewpoints, right? Like in a lot of this stuff is very anti sort of disability. You look at the assistant who is sort of hunchbacked, and how we've seen a character like that time and time again be treated as other, lesser than, and we're seeing it here. And in fact, that Fritz character is just kind of despicable. And
the decision to include the character is interesting too, because one of the core elements of Victor, I feel like, from the novel is sort of isolationist.
Yeah.
And then you add in a character who's sort of his assistant, and then he's just a mad scientist now.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah, this version, and that's like one of the only reasons I was kind of okay with them giving him a different name, because this version of I guess Dr. Frankenstein, I don't know how to refer to him. It feels like a different character in many ways. Like we still have the Elizabeth connection, but like, yeah, this version is all mad scientist and with very little of the internal turmoil that we see in the novel over what have I done and reckoning with all that. And in fact, he feels worse for Fritz, I think, than any other character we see. Is he's like, oh, Fritz, he's like kind of overcome with guilt over what happens to Fritz, and that's the only real guilt we see out of him, right? Not what have I done and what kind of life have I given this monster.
He has like the fever for a minute, where like when he kind of goes into his little sickness for a bit and they take him out of the windmill. But like, yeah, he never really gets his comeuppance, and he kind of ends up being the hero at the end, which surprised me. I was like,
kind of, yeah.
That took a
felt very like that's of the time, right? Like they needed the main character to win and have a happy ending. Like, unfortunately, as much as it doesn't really play well.
Well, I thought his best friend was going to win. I thought that like at the beginning when Elizabeth and Victor, the best friend, they kind of have like a little like spark there where he's like, oh man, you're marrying him, but I have feelings for you too. And I was like, oh, he's going to be the hero. And my theory was that they gave him the name Victor because he's going to be the victor. Like he's going to win. And so it's like, okay, great. The evil mad scientist is going to die and he's going to come in and get the girl. And That's not what happened.
Yeah, and I thought they were also kind of going that way because at one point, and I thought, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but Henry turns to Victor and says, "Take care of Elizabeth. You know what I mean," or something like that. Like, I was like, oh, what is he saying? Oh, so this opening part, I think the other thing we got to talk about is this sequence of imbuing life, galvanizing this corpse into life, and I was taken with that moment where they raise the table up through the opening in the ceiling to be in the storm. Like, I wasn't expecting that. I thought the lightning was going to strike and we were going to see a bunch of lightning on the machines. I didn't expect the raising at all. It's kind of cool. It definitely looks amazing. I did feel like the focus on the science is sort of shifted completely to the power of the heavens that even Henry here doesn't really understand. And he's just sort of like using God's power to imbue life into this thing. He's identified this, special ray of light, he says, but other than that, it felt like, I don't know, like less scientific somehow than the novel that was written 100 years before.
Yeah. There's this shot too where the monster walks out and they like reveal the sunlight. He like reaches out towards it, and like the way he reacts there like feels kind of holy, like kind of reaching for something that I don't know. I maybe I was reading into that a little bit.
No, yeah, I can see what you're saying. Yeah.
That was such a beautiful scene. I really, really, really enjoyed it as a piece of filmmaking, and I think that was the moment, like the monster's creation, and at that moment to me really sold me on what there is to appreciate in actually seeing this movie, and not just like learning third hand what the iconic moments are.
Mm-hmm.
You know what that kind of also illustrates to me, just as like kind of a storytelling aside, the role of the audience is distinct from all the other characters in this movie, because I think it's just the audience and perhaps the filmmaker who seem to be in on the story that's playing out with the monster and how it's being abused and how it's being mistreated and misunderstood. None of the other characters seem to get this at all. But we as the audience do, and the filmmaker's putting it there, but none of the other characters we see are doing it. And I was thinking about how, like, in writing, that can also be the case, right? Where the goal of the story can be to evoke that emotion in the reader, but you might not see that reflected in any of the characters that are in the story itself, but it might just be your role as the reader coming to it.
It's almost like getting information that we shouldn't have, in a sense, but we're kind of picking up on it, and the characters can't because they're so...
Yeah, and it makes you feel like you're picking, like you're getting something that the rest of the characters are missing. Like you're ahead of them. Like you get something that they don't see. And it's just cool because you know that isn't an accident. That's been put there by the creator of the film, because he wants you to feel that way.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, I hadn't thought about it as like a point of view change, that like, there's actually some scenes here that only the monster's experiencing. And like, in some ways that is very true to the spirit of the novel, where you've got these nested stories where each person is kind of giving a firsthand account of how they saw things.
Yeah.
Which would have been, so it's kind of a really cool adaptation decision there to like see how can you get across those different points of view of these different stakeholders. And even though, because the novel's also framed as kind of Victor's story, but the monster's the one that we all kind of love when we read it.
And that's the sign to me that this filmmaker did read the novel, right? Because the idea of the empathy for the monster, I think, comes from Mary Shelley's work.
And like just what the actor brings to it's incredible.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about Boris Karloff. He wasn't the first choice. He was kind of unknown at the time. James Whale saw him in like the Universal Commissary, so they're eating together in the same area, and he like goes up to him and slips him a note and asks him to be a part of this. And Boris Karloff, I guess, jokingly in hindsight, says like,
"Will you be in my movie?"
I think it was more like, "Will you play this like grotesque monster?" And then Boris Karloff took it to be like, "I thought I was looking pretty good that day. I was wearing a suit and everything." And
you look like a monster. Was he like really tall or something? Like, is there something about, I don't know much about him.
They use a lot of prosthetics and things to help. There's actually legend stories that I've read that are kind of debunked at this point, but supposedly within this film and subsequent Frankenstein films, he due to like the brace and some of the things that they had created for him, like hurt his back and dealt with really bad back problems for a long time. But somebody was just debunking it, quote unquote, and saying that he had injuries before and they were exacerbated. And I was like, well, either way, he got hurt from the film.
Yeah, if you're exacerbating previous injuries, that's still bad.
It's really unfortunate they had to like suffer through that in that way, but they kept asking him to come back for all the Frankensteins that they could. And this is, I think, a good moment to also mention that this is like sort of, they were doing what Marvel is doing now. They were like, oh, you guys like the Wolfman and you like Dracula and you like Boris Karloff's Frankenstein or the monster. They started blending them together. They're like Wolfman meets Frankenstein, and they started having them in the same movies together.
So so the marketing behind this might have also been sort of the what we were talking about earlier to blame, as they might have just been referring to this creature as Frankenstein, I assume.
Really, I think so.
Yeah.
But so Boris Karloff took 4 hours each day for Jack P. Pierce to apply this cumbersome costume, which weighed 46 pounds, and he had to wear it in the uncomfortable heat of the summer. Each of his shoes weighed 13 pounds.
What?
Well, that's why he walked so slow.
No joke.
They really like piled on a lot of stuff, and I read that the monster, when he carries Dr. Frankenstein up the mountainside and to the mill, at the insistence of James Whale, Boris Karloff actually carried Colin Clive in these shots up a mountain, basically.
Wow.
Several times over several days. He was 44 at the time, and he had like a back brace on, 13-pound boots, and he was badly injured due to this.
40-pound costume, and then he's carrying a full-grown man.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds tough.
It just sounds like the kind of thing that you hear in the 30s that would never happen these days.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me when I know the kind of shit that was going on even in like the 80s. Like when we cover 80s movies, it feels like the Wild West compared to today.
Well, we talked about the stuff with children and the child labor filming laws and everything that came into effect after the Twilight Zone. And yeah,
Disaster.
It's really unfortunate that like something has to happen before people will take the necessary precautions.
Somebody's got to die, maybe a few people, before someone starts caring.
Wow.
It's really sad,
Yeah.
really, really sad. Jack P. Pierce, I mentioned, is the makeup designer, and apparently Universal has the licensing for the makeup of the monster through like 2027 or something like that.
Wow.
So it could be entering, like this film and some of the licensing things with this could be entering the public domain.
Okay.
But, they keep pushing that back. They keep changing laws so that isn't the case. But yeah, we have Jack P. Pierce to thank for the flat head, the electrodes or bolts that are there, the eyelid sort of being pulled down some, and then the suit being really boxy. Those are all his decisions.
Such an iconic
in
look.
Creating an iconic character.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
All right, just to continue down the behind the scenes rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Bela Lugosi was the actor who played Dracula previous to this film coming out, and was the first choice, I believe, to play the monster in this film, but famously turned it down. And I think when he left, the original director also left. And so the script was given to James Whale, who refused to do it because he thought it was a joke. It had been erroneously reported that Lugosi refused to conceal his handsome face with heavy makeup. However, miscellaneous photos give evidence of his history of wearing heavy makeup for different parts prior to this movie.
Yeah, I mean, he looks pretty gross as Dracula, right? Like in that original film.
I think he's like sort of like,
Like
it was the
sexy
beginning of
gross,
that sex
like-
symbol sort of like.
Okay, maybe I'm thinking of a different
Yes.
version of the movie.
Yeah. Are you thinking of Gary Oldman's like Bram
No,
Stoker?
but isn't
version?
even that like referring to an older one where you see the shadow and the long nails and
Nosferatu.
Nosferatu? That's
yeah.
what I'm
Okay.
thinking of. But
Right.
okay, but that's not Bela Lugosi.
No.
Okay.
So we're overdue for a hot Frankenstein, is what you're saying. Like, well, there has been a hot Frankenstein. Like,
Oh, I'm sure.
you know.
All right, more on Lugosi after Dracula. Some people regard his decision to turn down Frankenstein as one of the worst decisions of his career, but in actuality, he was offered not the same role that Karloff would go on to play, but that previous version that I don't know that I've mentioned too much, but basically Robert Florey had recharacterized the monster as a simple killing machine without a touch of human interest or pathos, unlike in the original Shelley novel. So this reportedly caused Lugosi to complain, "I was a star in my country, and I will not be a scarecrow over here."
He turned down a different version of the script.
Different version. And I think, we're better off for the fact that it traveled through a couple of hands, because I think James Whale was the right one to direct it. I think he understood the character in a way that it sounds like that original script did.
Right. More like what I was kind of expecting from this movie, honestly, it sounds like.
Just a straight up scary monster with not the layer of empathy there,
Yeah.
So continuing the plot, Frankenstein's monster, despite its grotesque form, seems to be an innocent, childlike creation. Henry welcomes it into his laboratory and asks it to sit, which it does. He opens up the roof, causing the monster to reach out towards the sunlight. Fritz enters with a flaming torch, which frightens the monster. Its fright is mistaken by Henry and Waldman for an attempt to attack them, and it is chained in the dungeon, where Fritz antagonizes it with a torch. Hearing Fritz shriek in the dungeon, Henry and Waldman run down, finding the monster has strangled and hanged Fritz. The monster lunges at the two, but they lock it inside. Realizing the monster must be destroyed, Henry prepares an injection of a powerful drug, and the two conspire to release the monster and inject it as it attacks. When the door is unlocked, the monster lunges at Henry, and Waldman injects the drug into the monster's back. The monster falls to the floor unconscious. Henry collapses from exhaustion, and Elizabeth and Henry's father take him home. Henry is worried about the monster, but Waldman reassures him that he will destroy it. While Henry is at home recovering and preparing for his wedding, Waldman examines the monster. As he prepares to vivisect it, the monster strangles him. It escapes from the tower and wanders through the landscape, encountering a farmer's young daughter, Maria. She asks him to play a game with her in which they toss flowers onto a lake. The monster enjoys the game, but when they run out of flowers, he throws Maria into the lake, where she disappears beneath the surface.
It's the yeet of injustice.
Yeah. He didn't mean it. He yeeted too hard.
Yes. So can I just say I think we are going to agree on this, but like, Fritz deserved what he got. Like, he fucked around, he found out. Like
100%. Yeah.
I did not cry. I like clapped when that happened. I was like, go monster.
Right. I just didn't understand. So like they were worried that it was violent, and then Fritz antagonizes it. And I'm like, what? Okay, so you're afraid of the creature, you're locking it away, but also you're going to fuck with it and get it all pissed off.
Not only that, Fritz gets a whip out and starts whipping the monster for no reason. I guess just to make him quiet, I guess, because it was making a lot of noise. But they're up in an abandoned tower in the middle of nowhere. Who cares?
Makes no sense. Fritz, nobody misses you.
Yeah.
No.
Bye.
You ended as you deserve, and the only shame there is that they extrapolated the need to do something about the monster after that. Because I was like, maybe you could just given him a little time, like.
Right. I've heard that if you just like throw some flowers into the water with him and teach him that you don't throw people in, he'll be fine.
Yeah. He'd be okay. I mean.
I want to talk a little bit about Baron Frankenstein, who gets a decent amount of screen time, and I thought was a pretty interesting character. He's one of those people that, like, in real life, I'm sure this guy would have a lot of things to not like about him. But as far as his role goes in this movie, I kind of liked him. He's super grumpy. He's kind of funny. Like, he's super sarcastic, and he's like snarking at everybody. The guy comes in and he's like, oh, young Henry's a spitting image of his father. And he's like, God forbid. I don't know. He's just like a really funny, self-deprecating at times. And he's wearing a ridiculous like smoking jacket and hat. And he's got this weird pipe. And I thought he was such a distinct character. He puts on a monocle at one point when he goes to the tower. And he's just, I don't know. He reminds me of my own grandfather in some ways. A lot of like the way his humor was, which I don't know. I mean, I know this is like way predates that, but I don't know. I thought he was a pretty funny character, and a pure invention for the film. Just, this version of Victor's father in the novel it would be was not nearly this guy. It was
I thought that their whole interaction I know this is kind of a different time, but the whole interaction when they get to the tower and they're knocking on the door. And Fritz is sent to like check, and he like peeks out, and then he closes it and runs back, and he's like, "It's just a bunch of people." And then Frankenstein is like not Victor, but
Henry.
Harry Frankenstein. Henry Frankenstein is up in the tower.
Wait, who's Harry Frankenstein? There's another Frankenstein has shown up.
Different story. So he's up in the tower, like looking down at them, and then they keep running back and forth, and it's just like pouring ass rain with that like godly lightning strikes that'll bring a Frankenstein to life, that'll bring a monster to life.
One thing that we didn't talk about last time, and I do want to touch on, is how Henry is at like all it takes is a challenge by basically insinuating that he might be crazy, and he's like, "Oh, you think I'm crazy, do you? Come up into my laboratory and let me show you who's crazy." And he takes him up there and shows like that's all it takes, and then it's like a challenge to him. And there's this weird like direction thing where he's like, you sit. And he's like, no. And he's like, you sit. Also, Elizabeth, I'm going to be nice to you. You sit. And then you, Professor, sit. Okay. And then he's going to walk over and then he's like, you want to come see the body? Yeah, come on over. And I'm like, why did you just spent so long making them all sit and then now you're making them come over to look at the, it was so weird. I don't know what, it was like a weird power play or something. But yeah, I don't know. And then he's making the monster stand up and sit down from the chair, like first thing. And Reed just likes telling people what to do, I guess.
He loves to see, you should see his dog. He's just like constantly, sit.
Super well trained.
Frankenweenie, you know.
That's good.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And I remember like the time when the dad visits the tower and like that being a really big deal. It's almost like, oh no, we can't let Dad see my monster in the basement. Fritz, go make sure he stays quiet. That he wasn't afraid of like his fiance and his professor like witnessing what he was doing, but
No, he's this like old guard who is not going to understand. Like you just know.
Why aren't you making me grandbabies? Yeah. Like
He's convinced it's another woman. He's like, no, it's another woman. I don't care what you say. It's another woman.
Totally. Yeah.
I like the interesting relationship between Henry and his professor too, because the professor's like doesn't want to believe it, is like, you're bullshitting me at first. And then eventually is like more intrigued, and then it works, and then is like, wanting to vivisect and do all these things.
Is that a bit of hubris we see from the professor too? Because he says that he'll destroy it humanely or something, and then he's then taken it upon himself to, it seems like, study it some more.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. He wants to learn about the ray of light as well.
Yeah.
Clearly.
We even get like a shot of his notes where he's writing about how it's become more and more resistant to the shots over time, setting up the moment where we see the hand. And it's so funny. Like, that's one of the things that's so quaint today, to see the hand slowly come up and grab on the back and then like, oh my God. And then it cuts away and I'm like, that's it?
That's a pretty iconic shot as well. People were horrified, I'm sure, in the theater when it came up and grabbed him.
Yeah, you probably people screaming in the theater.
Something I did want to mention, just with the set design and everything, I noticed there were a few times when they would sort of dolly from room to room, when the professor and everybody shows up, and I thought that was so cool to like give us this really sprawling, large environment to establish all of that. And it just felt, like I said, it felt pretty novel for the time. Like, it felt like something that people weren't doing in that way, and everything felt a lot boxier. Like, you're in a room, okay, we're going to lock it down and we'll be in that room. And this just gives it a lot of character, I think. Yeah,
there were a moment sort of highlights what you're talking about to me, was in the house when they're looking for the monster. And they go up to, I believe, the second floor, and the camera like goes from left to right, I think, or maybe right to left, or maybe it does both. But it's sort of moving in a way that it probably wouldn't be able to in a real house. It's kind of going into different rooms, and it sort of shows that like this is actually a set, but in a way that makes it also like the camera is kind of magical, right? Like the camera is able to do something that like it shouldn't be able to do. And we still see that every now and then in movies today, right? Like it's a choice to have a camera move through a wall or something that it shouldn't be able to move through.
I especially like that moment you're talking about where it sort of dollies over and then we see into the room. We don't go into the room, but we see like through a hallway into another room where they're like searching for the monster, I think, right?
Yeah. Because the monster has come to the house at that point.
Tearing the rooms apart, and we're seeing them like jump into each room just from tracking across and following them do that. It's really cool.
So this section makes me think a little bit about like these different killings / murders that the monster is doing, and like we can all agree that Fritz deserved it.
Yeah.
I think we can agree that the professor deserved it too. I mean, he was literally like, that was self-defense to like stop a man from dissecting you. Do you think the little girl deserved it? Like, let's just be controversial.
No. I don't think the girl deserved it, but it was an accident. That's the only one I think he killed accidentally. The other two he killed on purpose. And that's what's tragic.
So, like, do you think it was just criminal nature right there to throw little girls into the water when you're playing a costume game? Or you think it was just over-exuberant eating, just getting into the spirit of throwing things?
An accidental yeet.
I think it was just childlike joy and, like, misunderstanding. Yeah.
That really was a sweet scene. I'm glad this monster got one person to like be nice to him, unlike the one in the book who never had anyone. Like,
and we saw the smile, right? We saw an actual smile from the monster as he's happy about this flower.
And she could see him. She wasn't blind. Like, she could literally see him, and she wasn't concerned.
Yeah. She comes up and, approaches him and talks to him and is friendly with him. And I think, there's commentary being made there as well, right? Yeah. Like, what society does to us over time and how it imposes its own viewpoint on people. And when we're young and innocent, we don't have that. We haven't unfortunately absorbed any of that. Haven't learned. Which will eventually be unfortunate, not unfortunately,
I knew what you meant. But yeah.
It's unfortunate that later you will.
Yeah, she hasn't learned to see someone who looks different.
And we see what happened to her. I'm just saying. Just kidding.
Yeah, I guess bad messaging there, yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah, I guess you're right.
Were there any other... He doesn't kill anyone else, though, right? Is that the last one?
And in fact, I think the body count is, like, pretty... like significantly lower here than in the novel, right? Elizabeth survives.
She does.
Yeah.
Yeah, she had a much better role, I thought, in this movie. I thought that they did some interesting things with her, and I like that she had just more of a character and more lines and more personality.
It does work, but I was unclear on whether or not the creature even attacked her, or if she just got scared.
I think she just got scared.
Because when she was laying on the bed when they came in, I was like, oh. Like, she's dead, but then she moves. And I was like, oh, I guess she's not dead. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I guess the monster didn't. Which is just a very different version of the monster, right? Because the monster we get in Mary Shelley's novel knows that Victor created it and is like, I'm going to tear apart your life and kill everyone you love and care about. Whereas this version of the monster is not doing that. And I guess it was just going there to, like, explore, maybe to look for Henry, but I was unclear why the monster even went to the house, right? Like, why not just wander off into the wilderness? Yeah, I wasn't sure about that, I guess.
You mean looking for people?
Yeah, because I thought they were going to bring it back and be like, now at some point the monster decided, I'm going to come and kill someone that my creator cares about. I thought that's where we were going, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
He already killed Fritz, whose creator definitely cared about, but, yeah. I had one note to myself on that scene where he breaks into Elizabeth's room, and it's just that the artist known as Frankenstein, or whatever you call him, is such a moron in here as well as in the book. Like, he locks Elizabeth into the room. He locked her in. He locked her like she's a child into the room and walks away. And then that's the only reason that situation happened. I was very frustrated that on everyone's behalf, he did that. I'm like, man, dude.
You know what's also weird about that scene where he throws the child into the lake? Like, I thought that was like, I don't know, it just made me think of like when you're a kid and somebody bumps you into the pool. Like, I thought he was just being playful, and I was so surprised that the child just dies. I was like, whoa.
I totally read it as him being playful too. Like, maybe he didn't understand, but clearly she drowned because she couldn't swim, so it's on her, right?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, and like, how deep was that water? Like, probably like 2 feet deep, right? Like, couldn't have been that deep.
She's really bad at swimming. Like,
do you think it plays better if you cut away here? I wonder if the censored version plays better.
Oh, it might be scarier.
If he grabs her and maybe you hear a splash and like, does it play better?
And all you see is the father later carrying her.
It would change it because you would imagine that the monster held her under would be where my mind would go, whereas we saw that this was an accident, which to me changes it quite a bit.
Apparently, people who had seen the edited version like that, the censored version, believed that she might not have been dead.
Oh, but he's like carrying her body in.
That's true, yeah. I think that's probably cut as well, though, from the censored version.
Oh, okay. You would have to. Which is a shame, because you were right earlier when you said just what a great shot it is. It's just
yeah. As the whole party changes in tone, as everybody sees what he's carrying, and that was quite a scene.
Another thing I was struck by just with these crowds is like they do a great job with the sets and the settings, and if they were on location in certain towns. But just the sheer number of people in some of these older films, like I think Ben-Hur is a super famous example of this. Like, giant crowd shots used to be practical, all practical, and just seeing this entire mob with their torches and stuff, and the dogs pulling them along, and there were a few times where I was shocked just at just seeing that many people on film and knowing it's real does something to the scene. Like it really lends some believability to it.
I was wondering, because like this is trying to evoke German, like being in Germany, but nobody, they don't really, like, I couldn't detect anybody who actually had a German accent. They
all
use
British, I think.
Yeah, they use a couple German words, but like, yeah, these are not German accents at all.
Right, it could have been Austria. Like, 'cause
Yeah.
I think in the book, Frankenstein is Austrian.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I actually did read something about this. The time period and setting of the film are never mentioned and have been the subject of continuous debate. The electronic devices in this film and its sequel suggest a time period of the late 1800s, but Mary Shelley actually wrote the book in the early 1800s. The names of characters and locations seem to be mainly German origin, but the actors are mostly British and speak with British accents. Director James Whale said that it is meant to be like a fairy tale set in no particular year.
Oh. Okay.
So speaking of anachronisms, I did do a Victor Frankenstein hand washing watch while watching this. And for anyone
great.
who didn't catch last week's episode, during the period that Mary Shelley wrote her novel, it was before hand washing had been invented as like a scientific thing to reduce disease. And I did notice that the professor was wearing gloves when he did that dissection, which may or may not have been accurate. I'm not sure that in Mary Shelley's time he would have bothered with the gloves. He would just rinse in some water and then gone and delivered a baby. And, you know.
That's interesting. I guess I assumed it was supposed to be contemporary for the time the movie was released. But you're saying maybe that wasn't supposed to be the case.
Well, I think I think some of the technology in Villages would have you believe that it's old, like it's older than 1930s.
Okay.
I see.
I would think, but
There wasn't any cars, now that you mention it, which there would have been
Right.
probably some cars around that time period, right? Some like at least early automobiles, whereas this was all like horse and buggy kind of thing, I think.
right. To talk about the hand washing and the gloves too, I wonder if that's just an oversight and not thinking about the history of that kind of thing. You know what I mean?
be
Because
that.
they're like, oh yeah,
I'm
doctors
sure.
doctors wear gloves now.
It's one of those things, right?
And-
Everything's intentional except for the occasion when it's not and it's an accident.
right, and it works out. If it does work out, or
Then you could just say it was intentional.
They're just using shorthand. Like, I mean, I really don't hold against the filmmakers here for not being up to my level of scientific history standards, but, you know.
no, but I like that we're noticing that. Those are big, you know, those are like
great.
Easter eggs.
Take credit for it, right? Like that's what authors do too sometimes. Did you mean for this and this and this to play together and for it to create this overarching theme? And yeah, absolutely. I meant that. Good on you for picking that up.
Like, reviewers would come out to review my stories to know what the story was about, to be like, oh, yeah, that's what that story's about. You kind of wonder if, I'm sure it happens to filmmakers too, where you're like,
You're being psychoanalyzed by your audience.
totally.
Sometimes you're so close to it, it's hard to see what you've done and to like.
It's true. Yeah.
Sometimes it takes like a little while after it's been out before you look back at it and go, oh, I see what I was doing now. But at the time, I didn't really realize what I was doing.
Yeah, it's true. Like, what exactly was stewing around in your brain and why, and like how that eventually produced the shape of a story. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to read this last section here.
Okay.
With preparations for the wedding completed, Henry is happy with Elizabeth. They are to marry as soon as Waldman arrives. Victor rushes in saying that Waldman has been found strangled. Henry suspects the monster. The monster enters Elizabeth's room, causing her to scream. When the searchers arrive, they find Elizabeth unconscious. The monster has escaped. Maria's father arrives carrying his drowned daughter's body. He says she was murdered, and the villagers form a search party to capture the monster. During the search, Henry is attacked by the monster. The monster knocks Henry unconscious and carries him to an old mill. The villagers hear his cry and find the monster has climbed to the top, dragging Henry with him. The monster hurls the scientist to the ground. His fall is broken by the vanes of the windmill, saving his life. Some of the villagers bring him home while the rest of the mob set the windmill ablaze with the monster trapped inside. At Castle Frankenstein, Henry's father celebrates the wedding of his recovered son with a toast to a future grandchild.
Yeah. Windmill scene was the one that made me think of Sleepy Hollow immediately. That toss was pretty comical to me because it's such a dummy being tossed and it looks so funny. Like the arms, I feel like the arms were backwards or something as it's tossed. Like this is not convincing at all. And then it lands on the thing, and it looks so like weightless as it lands, and then it falls to the ground, and then all of a sudden it's backwards him, and it reminds me of something you'd see in a comedy these days, where they're
Yes.
leaning into the fact that you can tell it's fake.
Was this like the origin of the pitchfork mob stereotype or trope about the torch carrying villagers going to go burn?
Unfortunately, I think that was a real thing. I think that's something people really did.
Oh no, that's horrifying. So they might probably have some practical. It gets dark.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a sort of trope that's been created for just like a villagers with the torches is a thing now. And I would think it's probably at least early on, in that the life cycle of that trope.
Yeah, like an early version of it. And as much as I'm giving them crap for the way the body looked, there was a shot when they pull back from the flaming windmill, and I'm pretty sure it was all miniature. And it was on fire, and then there was actually little miniatures of all the people in the crowd that had little torches they were holding that were on fire. And I thought that was actually really cool, because I was looking at it, and it held long enough for me to notice that none of them were moving. But if you're not like staring at it, you wouldn't notice that, and you would kind of just think that this was like a really pulled back shot of this incredible scene. So at times it looked really good. There are other moments where they would go into this like mountain set, and the same thing with the grave set, where you could see the like rippling of whatever like texture of the backdrop there was, and I was like, "Ooh, this is really taking me out of it." Where you could tell it was not sky you were seeing.
Some of the time, the thing that doesn't work with me, and something I think people realize more and more as time went on. I'm sure they realized it in this time, and it just was like they were constrained by their studio space. But if you don't, those backdrops are great, and yes, when you move them further back, you have to make them bigger, but the more distance you have, the more depth you're getting in the frame, because it feels like sometimes when you look at it, you can almost squint your eyes and it feels like they're almost up against a wall or something.
Yeah.
And whenever it feels like that and you don't have that depth in the frame, it just loses some of that cinematic quality of what you're looking for.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like we've talked about like differences in technology and what you're viewing it on too. Now, but the counterpoint to that is that film is film, and when you saw it projected, it was good quality even back in the day, right? Yeah. So you probably could tell these things if you saw it in the
for the most part, depending
theater.
on the quality of the print and that kind of thing, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that does kind of pull me out some of the time when I watch classic films is the sound quality. I always find it, sometimes it's difficult to catch what they're saying.
I had to turn on subtitles.
Yeah,
especially in the crowds.
It just has to do with the audio technology of the time.
Yeah. That reminds me. Speaking of audio, I thought there was an audio motif they were going with where it started out in the start of the film where you kept hearing this like knocking on the coffin. And it sounded to me like they had a microphone inside the coffin, or maybe they just like later on did it, like overdubbed it with the sound of something. But it evoked the idea that you were like inside the coffin hearing the shovel hitting the wood. And then multiple times in this film, people are pounding on doors, and there's this like mysterious pounding. You don't know what it is. And I wonder if they're just trying to evoke that like knocking on death's door. I don't know. Like, is there something going on there? Because I felt like they kept coming back to that sound over and over again.
I mean, I could definitely see that. It also like thumping makes me think of heartbeats and stuff as well. So maybe there's something there with that. Speaking of sound effects, I've read that this is the first that famous thunderclap at a castle sound effect. I read that this is the first time it was ever used, and it's gone on to be like one of those those reused sound effects.
There's a sound that we were recording one time, and there was this like perfect peal of thunder on James's audio, and I think we even put it in the episode that it was on, and then maybe we reused it in another episode. But I was going to say, I think this is a perfect project to include it again, because that the power of the heavens needs to be in this piece, I think.
Do you just want to drop it in right now?
Sure,
right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I say it's alive and then have it happen?
Oh yeah, do it.
It's alive.
I hope that comes out. I'm excited.
It's interesting. Like, I find this movie really, really, really effective horror in how it frames what happens to the monster for the most part. Like, in some ways, I find it really appropriate to see the monster as the protagonist. Because when he's first created, what's his name? Non-Igor, Fritz tortures him with the torch. And, like, you can see that, like, he develops this fear of fire. And at the very end, then we see him die by fire.
Yeah.
And just the whole way the movie is framed is very tragic. And in some ways, like, you just see this monster live this life of unspeakable cruelty that from everyone that he meets, except for the girl that he eats into the water. And then meet this end where everyone confronts him with the thing that he's most afraid of in the entire world. And that be kind of how he goes out.
You just set off a connection in my head.
Oh, go for it.
So in Game of Thrones, which we have covered the first book on this podcast.
So A Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah, Song of Ice and Fire. The Hound is tied to Sir Gregor Clegane, who is very Frankenstein's monster and sort of his what ends up happening with him. But the Hound is terrified of fire, which he is then confronted with. And I wonder how much Martin was playing with that, because he's of a similar age to Stephen King, probably grew up on similar things, and maybe the universal monsters. People have already pointed out that Roose Bolton is very vampiric, and a lot of those, I mean, the werewolves of House Stark and the wolf, they're almost wolfmen in and of themselves. So there's, kind of playing with a lot of these universal monsters. And again, we just see the effects in ways that you wouldn't expect getting into all the other media. Oh,
I think those are definitely legit references he was making.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool.
It's funny because after we see the monster die, for me, the rest of the movie is unnecessary.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
There's one scene after with seeing Henry, and I'm like, yeah, I don't care about Henry. I don't care if he survived.
Oh no. Yeah.
Yeah, just fade to black from the lighthouse, from the windmill or whatever.
Yeah. I was surprised. I was shocked when he ended up living at all.
Yeah.
I thought he needed to die by the hand of his creation. I thought that we were going to get that.
He deserved it, but
He kind of deserved it, yeah.
In another adaptation. We know that Mary Shelley let him die, before the monster does, so.
I wanted to ask you, James, I don't know if you saw this in your research anywhere, but I was wondering if this movie is referencing, because we heard about stage productions being made even early on in the 1820s of this book. And how that, if that's something that continued to go on, which I assume it did, there must be a history of producing this novel as an adapted play. And so
Right.
I'm wondering if you're leaning into that, because you said he has this background in stage, right? And how he might be leaning into the versions. And was that where we saw the assistant get created? Because I can imagine
possible.
a role of the assistant being something that they would want to put in a play, all that.
Part of me wonders if that's why they sort of shirked the correct credit for Mary Shelley, because supposedly the screenplay for this film is based off of the play that existed before this film.
Okay.
Frankenstein is a 1931 American pre-code science fiction horror film directed by James Whale, produced by Carl Laemmle Jr., and adapted from the 1927 play by Peggy Webling, which in turn was based on Mary Shelley's 1818 Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus.
Okay, so yeah, I think there's kind of a game of telephone that goes on there too. Maybe the guy didn't read the novel. Maybe he just adapted it based on this play he saw.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. Apparently the play was adapted by John L. Balderston, and the screenplay was written by Francis Edward Farrow and Garrett Fort.
Who among them had read the novel? That's always my question. Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, and this is one of those stories, we talked about, Snow White is an example where it's so old. I mean, and Snow White is much older than this, but it's gone through all these different. Well, yeah, I guess I don't know. Didn't we say that even at the time the Brothers Grimm put it down, it was already an old tale?
Oh! I thought you meant the Walt Disney animated. I was like, that was kind of the 30s.
No, I meant the original tale. My point is that it's this old story that has gone through so many adaptations, and each adaptation itself can be the thing that someone experienced and then is reacting to, and the tale of this thing is just so big and is everywhere. And we talk about influential people in horror. That's why Mary Shelley is one of the most influential of all time.
It's kind of a Frankenverse going on.
Yeah.
Really, yeah. And then you start to talk about the Universal verse, and it gets bigger and bigger. I do have to mention, just because I find it kind of hilarious, and you don't at me, but they tried to recreate a Universal horror universe because of the success of the MCU, and they were building it up, and there was this Dracula film that came out that was not very good, and then they were doing The Mummy with Tom Cruise, and it just I think they had Johnny Depp was going to be the Invisible Man, and Russell Crowe was going to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or something. I can't remember what he was going to be, but there was all these connections that they were making, and the way that it just crashed and burned and never turned anything is unfortunate, but it also seemed like it was ill-advised. It didn't seem like it was going to live up to the old Universal monster sort of criteria.
I think it all comes down to you got to make good movies, and you got to tell good stories, and if you can't put the cart before the horse. And it seems like if you start planning this extended universe, like maybe start out with the first movie and make it really good first before you start
nail down a couple of good ones.
Planning all the other movies you're gonna make. I mean, the MCU started with Iron Man, which like maybe over time hasn't held up as being like the greatest of those movies, but is a pretty good movie even today. And you go back and watch it, and that's why MCU is what it is, right? Like because it started on solid foundation.
Pretty solid, yeah. I would say, yeah. That's a conversation for another time.
Different conversation, yeah.
If you want a good laugh, though, when they released the trailer originally for The Mummy with Tom Cruise, the person who uploaded a version that didn't have any background audio or soundtrack, and so it's literally there's a moment where Tom Cruise is tumbling around in a plane, and it's just his isolated scream. And it's incredibly funny. So Google that and see if you can find it because it's amazing.
Wow! So this is something that like millions of people saw because they uploaded it to YouTube.
A lot of people saw. I think they changed it pretty quickly, but you can still find it, and it's amazing.
That's pretty funny.
So while we're talking about the Frankenverse, can I ask a tangentially related question that is very important for me to hear your opinion on? I'm trying to like make up a game here. Like maybe I'll call it like the Franken game or something.
Okay.
But let's pretend that you are in Frankenstein's lab. And Fritz will go out and steal you one body part or organ of your choice, and you will gain the powers of whoever owned that thing. But the thing is also going to give you criminal tendencies. So, for example, you could get like Stradivarius's wrists and like become a great violinist, but you'll be an evil violinist, and like you'll have evil hands that will sometimes do evil things. So my question for you is, which body part are you going to go have Fritz steal for you and get the wrong one?
Right.
You know,
we should probably not lean into genitalia. We should probably go to someone.
Genitalia are off the table.
Young Frankenstein did that. It's already covered. We're good. So yes. Yeah.
All right. So I'll start with something just like I'll take Michael Jordan's feet.
Yes. So you're going to have like super basketball jumping abilities.
Yes.
But your feet will also have criminal tendencies. So do you have any ideas of what criminal tendencies your feet are going to have?
I don't know.
Yeah, my question is, are the criminal tendencies coming from someone else? Like, where are the criminal tendencies coming in
It's all because Fritz stole the wrong one. He had a jar of Michael Jordan's feet. So he's going to steal the wrong jar and put them on you, and you will get the powers. This is not a logical game. It's a fun game.
I see what's happened with Fritz. Okay, I get you.
Okay, so Fritz is doing the job. So
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Jordan has a notable shoe brand as well. So I think with the criminal tendencies of the feet, maybe I'll end up with a strong business or something.
An evil business.
So I was gonna say Stephen King's hands, I guess, because he types. Apparently, he just types so fast because he writes so many novels.
I totally changed my answer.
Okay, go ahead.
I want Roger Deakins' eyeballs.
Oh.
Okay, explain.
Because I want to see the world the way he does.
Deakins is the cinematographer behind Blade Runner 2049. He works with the Coens. He did
Villeneuve a lot.
Villeneuve a lot.
He worked with everybody, really. Yeah.
Yeah, he's done a lot of like iconic movies that I'm drawing blanks on.
But you will also be evil eyeballs. So I mean, you will be.
Yeah, you won't get his eyeballs. You'll get somebody else.
Stealing people's credit card numbers without meaning to, and like
right.
I was thinking I want to go for like Chris Hemsworth's hair. He's got like a nice like scalp transplant and have like really beautiful long blonde Thor hair, but then the hair will be evil somehow.
Right.
Yeah.
Probably like.
I think if you have his hair though, his muscles just start to develop on your body, so you become insanely
it's terrifying. It's horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, be very very swole. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's quite a game to end on, I think. That's perfect. Are we ready to cast our vote? Is there anything else we want to talk about before we move into the vote?
I think I'm good. Yeah, let's get into the vote.
So, for me, like, this was fun. Like, seeing this movie, it was better than I expected it to be, honestly. My expectations for it were a creepy movie that maybe didn't really hold up as far as being creepy today, but I could tell was at the time scary. Iconic monster performance, but that would be about it. But instead, it was all of that plus empathy for the monster I didn't expect, plus that German expressionist filmmaking inspired, I should say, filmmaking technique that you were talking about that felt modern to me. I could see the artistic eye behind it. So there was a lot of cool stuff going on. But when it all comes down to it, like, just can't really hold up to Mary Shelley's work. It's such an iconic novel in the history of literature and the history of genre. It is, this movie owes a lot to it, even if we, as we've talked about, maybe it's, a few steps removed. So I got to give it up to Mary Shelley. She takes it for me.
Yeah. I don't blame you. Like, I agree that the film doesn't quite hold up to Mary Shelley's work, but I have to be what I think will be the contrarian here and say I'm going to go with the film because of the film history built into it.
You almost have to, right? Like, or someone will take away your filmmaking credentials if you don't.
Right. But so much notable, right? Like, it is very influential on its own. People know Frankenstein potentially more from the film than they do from the book, and Boris Karloff's performance has a lot to it. And then James Whale's, like, his like modern sensibilities, what would become sort of the trend going forward for sure for the next like 20, 30 years, and then is now still referenced heavily.
I like the idea that you'd go to like Full Sail to go into the school you teach at, and you'd like go to sign in, and all of a sudden your card wouldn't work, it wouldn't scan.
And they're
like, no, sorry, you no longer are allowed in this building.
You're out of here. We heard that episode. I was like, no.
All right, Rachel, you have the tiebreaker.
Yeah,
vote.
I've been sitting here pondering whether or not James has already committed an eyeball theft that we should know about. Because this conversation has helped me appreciate this movie on like a whole new level. Like, I think that I just want to give you both a big thank you for you really pulling out like what's beautiful about this movie and what's revolutionary about it, and just some things that I just never considered about the filmmaking of it. I feel like I learned a lot. It's really, really cool. I went into this movie with kind of a similar frame of mind as Luke, which is that like I expected it to be fun, but I had a pretty low standard because I was like, it's 100 years old. Like, I know, and sometimes with those really iconic movies, like, because you've seen so many other transformations and references on it, it can be hard to appreciate what it is because it can seem simple compared to like the transformations that come after it. So I don't regret watching it. I definitely think that I'd recommend it. If you haven't seen it, then see it. But for me, the standard I am using for making my decision is like, would I see it or read it again? And I think seeing it once, I feel like I've kind of seen it. I would read the novel again. Like, I've read it, I think, 2 or 3 times in my life, and I think I can see myself reading it again someday and revisiting it. So I think that I'm going to have to be on team novel for this one, although that's not a diss on the movie because it's great. So see them both, but yeah.
That metric is a good way, because I would much rather reread the book as well, but I'm gonna stay in my film camp on this one.
And I think it's fitting that somebody gives credit to the film. I can never knock you for that. Well, I'm so glad that you got a lot out of this, and I feel that way all the time diving into these movies, and I think I've only developed my own ability to see this stuff over time. And so it's always a lot of fun, and I think our listeners, those who have been with us for a long time, I think they also like that, the same kind of thing you were talking about, right? That's my hope, at least. So could you let our listeners know where to find your writing and you online? Because I do recommend, if you like Frankenstein, you should read Rachel's work.
Thank you, Luke. You can find me on Twitter at Rachael K. Jones. That's RachaelKJones. And my website has the same name at rachaelkjones.com. If you're a Frankenstein person, this is like kind of your speed and you want more like that, some of my stories you should definitely check out. There's one called The Greatest One-Star Restaurant in the Whole Quadrant, which is about cannibal cyborg food trucks, and you would definitely get a kick out of it. It's good times. There's also a really great anthology that just released called Tales from Anaris, which is stories that are in tribute to Ursula K. Le Guin, that I've got a story in that features local Portland authors, which is pretty awesome, all writing, because she was from the city, and all writing kind of in her tradition. And that has a story in it that I don't want to spoil too much, but also involves dissection and some body weirdness. And but yeah, you should go enjoy that. So yeah, please follow me and check out my stuff.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rachel. This was a lot of fun. For the entire journey through Frankenstein's lab and through the creation and the galvanism of this body being brought to life, it's been a joy. So thank you for joining us.
Can I leave the basement now? You can let me.
Yeah, I guess we'll allow it.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Rachel.
It was great to be here.
So, if you enjoyed this episode and our coverage of Frankenstein in general, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. I know on Apple Podcasts, we are creeping closer to 100 reviews. That's just an arbitrary number that I've been looking at for a long time and really hoping to get to. So, just a little extra push. If you haven't left us a review on Apple Podcasts and that's the way you're listening, please do it.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. Recently started up a TikTok as well, so you can check us out on there.
At Ink to Film on all of them. If you would like to support this podcast even further, if you really appreciate what we do and you would like to get some extra content or maybe some merch, we do have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/inktofilm. And on there you can get all of our bonus episodes, which we release monthly. And we do other adaptations. So like say you listen to this version of this Frankenstein film and you wondered, what would they think about another version of Frankenstein? Maybe the one with Robert De Niro, which is I reportedly closer to the novel. That's the kind of stuff we cover over on Patreon. So check it out. For as little as $2 a month, you can get access to tons of bonus content.
And thank you to Mark Vander Meulen for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that's going to be a wrap on Frankenstein. We are excited to announce that we will be covering The Black Phone, which is a Joe Hill short story, has recently been made into a brand new movie. So we're going to be going from the 30s to a modern film. The only reason that wouldn't be what we covered next week is if for some reason we can't watch it in the theaters, like they take it out of the theaters. Assuming that hasn't happened and we're able to watch it, we will be covering it. So look for that next week, and we will be covering the son of Stephen King, if you didn't know, Joe Hill.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I've heard good things about the Scott Derrickson film too.
Cool. All right, that's going to be it. So until next time,
keep adapting.